I'm a 22-year-old female who lives in a pretty nice little college town in Idaho. Right after I had my son 2 years ago, I was pretty desperate for a job. My mom at the time was working a pretty nice hotel and said that they were looking for new housekeepers. So I put in my application and luckily got the job. I had worked in hotels before and had experience, so none of this was really new to me. A little background about being a maid. Where I worked, we were given a list in the morning of all the rooms that we were supposed to do for the day. It's usually split up by different floors. This list consists of vacant rooms, rooms that are supposed to be vacated that day, and stayovers. I usually try to get my stayovers done first because I honestly hate doing them and would just try to get them out of the way as soon as possible. When you go to a stayover, you knock on the door twice before entering and announce yourself once you enter, ensuring that you don't walk in on someone, even though it does happen sometimes. On this particular day, I went to start my list. The very first room was a stayover just for a couple of nights. It was located at the end of the hall and was a large suite. I knock on the door as usual and announce myself very loudly before I walk into the room. As I walked in, I noticed that it was pretty dark, and I checked the rooms. There were 2 bedrooms in this one. Now I noticed as I walked in that it was pretty dark. This wasn't unusual, so I brushed it off pretty quickly. There were 2 bedrooms in this suite, so I started working. I usually turn on all the lights before starting my cleaning, but since it was a stayover and I wanted to get out of there as soon as I could, I decided just to turn on the light in the hallway and rush through my work. Well, I'm in this room for about 15 minutes doing my usual routine when I enter the room farthest from the door. Now this room was extremely dark, but all I had to do was make the bed look okay, so I didn't have to turn on the light. As I was pulling the covers up, I began to hear something weird, almost like breathing and fast movements. That's when I looked past the bed and saw a dark figure in the corner. My heart raced as I noticed the wide eyes of a 40-something overweight guy naked in the corner. I stifled a scream as I noticed that he held his private parts in his hands. Excuse me, I muttered shakily. I didn't realize anyone was in here. But this creep just looked at me and began laughing. I took this as a bad sign and bolted out of that room. The rest of the day, I had another maid help me with the rest of the stayovers. Honestly, I wish that was the end of the story, but a day later, as that man was checking out, he left a note and a tip with the front desk person for the maid who had cleaned his room the previous day, meaning me. The note said,
"Thanks for the fun time. Hope we can meet again someday."
I shuddered at the thought. So, the only advice that I could give is that you should always make sure to treat a hotel maid very nicely, because you never know what kind of gross, creepy shit they might have seen that day. A few years ago, when my brother and I were pretty young, aged 10 and 16, we were home alone for 2 days. Now, my mom would usually never let us stay home alone, but her father was feeling really ill the night before, so she was traveling to New York City where her parents resided. She was only supposed to be gone for 2 days, so my brother and I weren't feeling scared or anything. Plus, my mom's best friend was going to be checking in on us every now and then. Just a little backstory. My name's Brooke and my brother's name is Joey. The day my mom had left, we hadn't really done anything other than watch Netflix and YouTube videos. It was getting pretty late and I was getting really sleepy. I told Joey that we should go to sleep, but He wanted to stay downstairs and continue watching Netflix. I guess he wasn't feeling sleepy yet. I shrugged and went up to my room and began to sleep. I think about 2 or 3 hours passed by until I woke up to Joey standing in front of my bed and begging me to wake up. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "Brooke, there's someone in the backyard. I'm too scared to stay downstairs. Please come with me." "Stop playing around. This is what happens when you're allowed to watch scary movies," I replied. Even though I didn't believe what Joey was saying, I could tell that he was genuinely scared, but I assumed it was because of the scary movies that he was watching. I then got up, took him to his room, and tucked him into his bed. "Don't worry, Joey. Nothing will happen. Just go to sleep," I told him as I left to my room. The next day, everything was the same. We were binge watching The Walking Dead and eating noodles 24/7. Joey seemed to have forgotten about whatever it was that had scared him the night prior, and I was just feeling relieved. Night came rolling around, and it was about 1 a.m. when we both decided to go to bed. Although Joey insisted on sleeping with me in my room, and I honestly just allowed him to. So we both slept in my bed, but then I woke up at around 3 a.m. because of a game notification on my phone. I lifted my phone to my face and was blinded by the brightness. In a quick reaction to the shocking brightness, I turned my phone towards the door, and I saw something that I will never forget. There was a very skinny, pale man standing right in front of my door, staring at me. He looked as if he was living in a sewer, or something worse. He had no shirt on, only ripped up cargo pants. His eyes were so plain, just staring right at me. I chalked all of this up to a quick hallucination and blinked my eyes and reopened them. But even so, he was still there. I prayed that Joey wouldn't wake up, otherwise he would never forget this sight in front of him for the rest of his life. "Hello?" I whispered. No reply. The man just continued standing there, staring at me. I felt like at any moment he was going to pass out because of how unhealthy he looked. I then took my phone and slowly dialed 911, but didn't tell the operator anything in the fear of the man attacking me for doing so. I could hear the operator questioning why I had called, but I didn't dare say a word. All of a sudden, though, I heard a bunch of loud noises coming from downstairs, and the creepy man quickly ran out of my room. I called my mom's best friend to let her know of the situation, but she wouldn't pick up. I texted my mom a few times, trying to break the situation to her without getting her worried senseless. That's when I heard a knock. Someone was knocking on my bedroom door. I immediately turned around and saw that Joey was now awake. I could see fear in his eyes, and I tried consoling him while the knocking continued and began to get louder. And just then, I got a text message back from my mom's best friend. "Brooke, lock your bedroom door and hide under the bed. There are a bunch of burglars in your house right now. I'm outside with a few police officers." I was shocked. How did my mom's best friend know that there were people in our house? How many people were there? I then heard a bunch of sirens go off and looked out the window and saw a bunch of police cars coming into our driveway. I felt so relieved, yet so scared, because we were still inside the house. I sat there in silence, not knowing what to do, and after a few minutes, I heard gunshots and the front door being broken into. I knew that the police officers were inside, and they came upstairs soon after and got us out of that room. Apparently Barbara, my mom's best friend, had come to check on us and realized that the front door and backyard doors were both wide open. She then told me that she heard yelling coming from the inside and began to call the police. I think the most disturbing part about this whole incident is that The people that invaded our house were really old people who escaped from their retirement homes or something like that. Apparently, we lived about 5 minutes away from a hospital that had a retirement home connected to it. That's why they randomly broke into the closest home they could find. But these weren't ordinary old people. Each one of them suffered from mental disorders. As the police officers began to comfort us and helped us out of the house, I walked outside, only to see all of the old people handcuffed, naked, and crying their eyes out. There were about 8 of them inside our house, a sight that, honestly, I'll never be able to unsee. The police officers then pulled out our security footage and turned it on. The police officers looked into our security footage, and it turns out that these old people were hiding in our backyard shed the day before. So, Joey was right about people being in the backyard. It's been about 5 or 6 years since this incident, and neither me nor Joey can stay home alone ever again. I remember very clearly the day I almost died. I was a freshman at Oklahoma State at the time, with a few months of summer left before the classes began. My friends, let's call them John and Jane, and I were very avid hikers and decided to take one final summer trip. Our destination was an area that we were very familiar with, having hiked there around 6 or 7 times before. It was a few hours away from our hometown, and we were, as always, very excited to get away. Being guys, John and I only had one bag packed each, while Jane had several. We met at John's place at around 6 a.m. that morning and took off in his Jeep. I recall being so excited, having no idea that my life would soon change forever. We arrived at the park at around 9 a.m. and began our journey up the first hill. Being August, the temperature was already in the mid-90s, and it was looking like a long day before we reached the first mountain peak. We ran into several other hikers and campers before we reached the guts of the park. This meant that we were so far into the forest that civilization disappeared. Around 1 o'clock, we stopped for a water break. All 3 of us were happily chatting about the scenery when we heard it, the cock of a shotgun. Now, this was a very distinct sound that John and I noticed right away. We stood to our feet and looked in all directions for the culprit, but we saw nothing. I remember John and I looking at each other in a what the fuck kind of way. There were no firearms of any kind allowed in this area of the park. We yelled out, "Hello? Who's there?" several times, but we never got an answer. After discussing the situation and going from freaking ourselves out to playing it off as a broken tree limb that had fallen, we decided to keep on our way. Personally, I was thrown off the whole rest of the hike that day, as were John and Jane. What had happened was extremely sketchy, but we were way too far in to turn back now. Darkness began to creep in at around 9 o'clock, and we were putting the finishing touches on our camp. We had set up an already roaring fire and 3 small tents for each of us. We ate our packed dinners and talked amongst the fire. We talked about funny shit and serious shit, as the 3 of us usually did. I remember Jane was in the middle of speaking about her upcoming classes when we heard another startling sound. Twigs and leaves being stepped on, clearly by human feet. I estimated about 20 yards into the darkness. Again, this brought us all to our feet, and we knew that this wasn't coincidental, that 2 strange humanistic sounds happened in our area within a park so large. We were surely being followed, and just as the steps began, They stopped as we stood in complete silence. Keep in mind, we had no suitable weapons to defend ourselves if needed, and absolutely no cell phone service. Jane, surprisingly, was the first to react. She yelled out, "Whoever it is following us, I'm letting you know that we do have a gun." Obviously, Jane was lying. John and I were impressed with her quick thinking. Just as adrenaline began to fall, a scuffed, gravelly laugh came from the trees. This was a low, sarcastic laugh, and we could barely hear it, but it was clearly a laugh. It continued as it faded, and we could hear the footsteps walking away out of hearing distance. We were shocked, stunned, and scared shitless. However you want to say it, we knew that we were in trouble. I tried to hide it, but a feeling of being trapped overcame me, and I'm sure John and Jane felt this as well. It was pitch black, and there was no way we were hiking back. We started throwing suggestions at each other and discussed our options. Jane was sobbing and shaking at this point. She was, and still is, a tough gal, so it was hard to watch at the time. We eventually all settled into one tent with our pocket knives drawn to our sides. Earlier, when I said that these tents were small, I mean they were small, maybe 5 feet in width and 7 in length, so we were crammed to say the least. It was hot and sticky and overly uncomfortable, but we felt much safer. Looking back though, it's kind of embarrassing to show how scared we were, especially 2 decently sized 19-year-olds. But trust me, when you're in a pitch black forest in the middle of nowhere, being stalked by an unknown, shotgun-wielding man, anyone would be frightened. After several hours of laying there sleepless, the situation became lighter. We began to slowly joke and poke fun at the situation, mimicking Jane's previous holler and the gun threat into the woods. We wondered out loud how long she had been a badass, and asked if she could be our personal bodyguard from there on out. To be honest, the whole situation was relaxing. We were completely exhausted from being so mentally distressed. It must have been about 1 a.m. at this point. That's when we began to fall asleep. I was the last awake, but was drifting quickly, when I heard more rustling of the leaves. I knew John and Jane were asleep by her heavy breathing and his snoring, and I didn't want to wake them. So I just laid there in silence and listened. The footsteps were slow and soft, but were getting closer. Before I knew it, they were nearly right outside the tent, and I jabbed John in the leg with a balled fist 3 times before he woke up. He was startled and loudly said, "Damn, what?" This set into motion a series of blurred events. All in one motion, Jane shot up, and in response to John, began freaking out while the footsteps outside darted towards our tent. A tearing sound in the tent slid right along my side as I rotated my body away from the attacker. In the chaos, I shouted, "John, get the gun and shoot this guy." As soon as I said those words, the footsteps sprinted back into the woods, and we nearly ran over each other exiting the tent. To sum things up, the man dragged a hunting knife through our tent, dropping it before running off. We ran through the darkness the rest of the night and into the early morning, until we were able to locate a cell phone signal to call for the police. That day, we had to guide the sheriff's office back to the scene to retrieve our things and give them the location. That's when they discovered the knife. We spent that entire day in the police station and gave our statements. They told us that we were so close to death, and I think about that every day. I don't know what that man wanted, or why he didn't just shoot us with the gun that we knew he had. But I'm beyond happy to have escaped with my life that night, and thank God that I made the false statement to John about that gun. I'm a senior now at a different school in Oklahoma, but I still keep in touch with John and Jane. However, I haven't been able to bring myself to go hiking again, or honestly do anything within a secluded area. I would encourage anyone who wishes to hike to always have an appropriate weapon on hand. I'm thankful for my life every day, and writing about this experience was therapeutic. Thank you for listening, and safe travels, my friends. My roommate at the time worked nights, and I was left alone at the house with my roommate's mother, who went to work at around 5 a.m. I had broken up with my boyfriend a few days earlier, and I thought everything was fine. Breakups are usually never easy on either party involved, but he seemed to understand that I could no longer deal with his heavy drug use, stealing, and irrational behavior. Or, at least, that's what I thought. The knocking started at exactly 12:23 a.m. I have 2 windows in my room, one behind my bed and one to the left. The knocking was originally coming from the window to the left of my bed. It started off as a soft knocking, followed by my ex-boyfriend's voice pleading for me to let him in. Naturally, I wanted nothing to do with him, so I just played it off and acted as if I was sleeping. The knocking grew louder and louder as time passed. With each knock came a new excuse for me to let him in. Eventually, though, the knocking subsided, and I assumed that he had given up. Not even 30 minutes later, the knocking began again, and this time, it was louder than ever. To be honest, it was no longer knocking, it was banging, and it had moved to the window behind my bed. He was moving from window to window, trying to get a reaction out of me. It's always the funny things that go through your mind in these types of situations. I was extremely thirsty, and had been since my roommate left, but because he kept knocking, I had felt confined to my room. After about 30 minutes went by, I just couldn't take it anymore. I slowly opened my bedroom door and made my way to the kitchen. I knew at this point that I was putting myself in a vulnerable position. I had to pass a sliding glass door to get to my kitchen and would be very visible from the backyard. As I was slowly creeping towards the kitchen, trying my best not to be seen, he shouted to me through the sliding glass door that his arm was broken and that he needed help. I screamed at him and told him to go away and made it clear that he was no longer welcome on this property. And that's when I heard the screen to my patio door ripping and pots breaking. I forgot to mention as well that the sliding glass door was slightly off track, meaning that he could get in at any time if he tried. Luckily, he didn't know that and just kept cursing at me from the patio. I ran to my room in hopes that he would leave now, and I saw that it was rearing 5 a.m. I sat there, waiting, and once again, the knocking subsided, and I felt like I could finally sleep. I was awoken again though, not too long after, by the sound of him trying to break into my room via the side window. I wasn't sure what to do at this point, so I grabbed every weapon I could find and hid them under my mattress. I even had a machete on my lap just in case. I have no idea how my roommate's mother slept through all of this. She knew of my ex and told me that if she ever saw him on the property again, I was kicked out. It was around 4:45 a.m. by this point when I heard her alarm go off. I was extremely afraid now, knowing soon I'd be left to my own vices. At 5:15 a.m., I heard the garage door open, along with her getting into her car and driving off. The knocking started again immediately. It was the window behind my bed again. I know you're probably wondering how I have the exact times of every incident that happened. And the answer is simple. I was messaging my roommate the whole entire time, keeping record of what was going on. Here's how things went, from bad to worse. The knocking was still going on outside, when suddenly, I heard the garage door opening. I looked outside for a vehicle, hoping that it was my roommate or his mom, but it was neither. Still hearing the knocking from outside, I was perplexed. I made sure my door was locked and that my cat was in my room. And that's when the knocking stopped once again. At this point, I didn't care if my roommate was at work or not. I called to let him know what was happening. He told me that it was just his mom, and to stay calm. I assured him, though, that it wasn't her, and that her car was nowhere in sight. And just then, I heard knocking at my bedroom door, and my ex whispering my name. I was in shock. I screamed to my roommate, "It's him! He's here! In the house!" I heard my ex say,
"You called the cops, you dumb bitch."
And then I heard running. And what freaked me out is that when I heard the running, it was not one set of footsteps running out of the house. It was several. I honestly don't know what would have happened if he had broken into my room, but I believe that I had escaped possible death that night, and I will never forget it. My family's always played little jokes on me when I was younger. That kind of made me paranoid than I otherwise would have been. They would always use phrases like, "That man over there is staring at you," or my personal favorite, "Do you hear those scratching noises?" Whenever they said this, someone else would be scratching the walls in a different room. Honestly, I was always a little bit gullible, but this never really helped. Also, a little bit of background on my family. I have both a mother and a father, and an older brother. Now, this story took place when I was around probably 9 or 10 years old. We were going to visit our cousin's family. They also had 2 parents, but 2 boys. They lived about half an hour away from us, so we were just visiting for the day. Most of the day consisted of us just being at their house, but later that night, they decided to take us out for a nice supper. After we finished up eating, we were about to get on our way home. Then right before leaving, they asked us if we wanted to do an extra activity before we left. We didn't know it, but the town cemetery was just a few blocks away from where we were eating, and apparently they invited us to have a little walk through it. It should be no surprise that I didn't want to go, but my family outvoted me on this one. Just the idea of being 2 blocks away from, or even walking through the cemetery was enough to send shivers down my back. We got there just a few minutes later, and ended up walking around the cemetery for a bit. But of course, my father couldn't help himself, and decided to mess with me for the short time that we were there. He would hide behind the biggest tombstones that he could find, and as I was walking by, he would either make very creepy noises behind it, or just jump out at me. I laughed along with him mostly, because I always knew it was my father, and that he wouldn't hurt me. Because of this, though, I began to feel a lot more comfortable with my surroundings, and even started guessing where he was going to try to ambush me next. I started gaining confidence in my observation skills, and became less and less scared by the second. And when my cousins asked me if I wanted to participate in the graveyard challenge, I reluctantly agreed. Now, just to explain the graveyard challenge, it's when 2 people from your group both go to one end of the graveyard all the way to the other end without having any light whatsoever. At least, nothing except the moonlight above you. Our cousins said that they had done this many times and assured us that it was safe. Now, at this time, I had no reason not to believe them. So, the rest of our group got into their cars and began to drive off, leaving me and my older cousin, who was 14 at the time. We began heading off to the other side of the graveyard. We just walked for a while, talking about whatever came to our minds. Being only 9 or 10 at the time, I looked up to the older kids, so having my 14-year-old cousin there really did help ease my nerves. But that's when things began to get odd. Just like before with my father, there was a figure behind the tombstones. I ignored it, of course, not wanting to get scared. I hadn't gained all this courage just to let my own delusions scare me. Although, as time wore on, the noises began getting louder, and the figure was still following us behind the tombstones. I started to think that this was all just a joke that the rest of the group was playing on us, so I just wanted to play along. The figure even looked exactly like my father had. My dad was wearing a white t-shirt, a red cap, and some tan khakis. In the dark, this figure looked almost exactly the same. And as we neared the end of the graveyard, the figure started fading off behind us. So, when we got to the end of our journey, and my father was standing next to the car in front of us, I immediately thought that it was him messing with us again. So I went up to him, laughing, asking, "How'd you get here so fast?" And he replied back in a very confused manner, "I drove the car?" Getting a little bit worried and sending him a confused look, I asked, "But you were following us back behind the tombstones. How did you get here first if you were driving?" I'd never seen my father's face become so pale in my life. He then told me to quickly get in our car and buckle up. Right after we did this, we headed straight back to our home. We later contacted our cousins again, asking the eldest if he had also seen the figure behind the tombstones as well. He said that he had also thought it was my father playing a prank on us. They later gave us more information when they heard from their local newspaper about an older man who loved to walk around the cemetery, either following or staring at people that passed by. Apparently, this man was arrested soon after for assault. No one knows how long this man had been doing this, but I definitely think that this was the same man that had followed me and my cousin through the graveyard that night. It's been about 14 years since then, and I still haven't gone back to a graveyard. My trust for those places has not and will not recover after this experience.